So let's get started. Well, thank you for joining. Welcome. My name is Cristina Ponce. I'm a partner manager for the ServiceNow store. I'm excited that you're joining us today to hear from xtype and Teradata, how Teradata has been able to gain efficiency and work on the compliance for their GCC and commercial ServiceNow environments with the help of xtype, our great ServiceNow partner. So let's get started, and please move to the next slide, Scott. Before we go to the content, you've probably seen this slide a million times, but please know that we might mention some forward-looking statements and information, so safe harbor reminder as always. And let's move into the housekeeping. You are going to be on mute for the duration of this webinar. Please use the Q&A box for any questions you have for our speakers on the content. We're going to leave some time at the end of the content to answer any remaining questions. And we are going to also send you a poll after we're finished, just to check how do you find the content. We also want to learn a bit more about you and where you are in your ServiceNow journey. So we're going to be asking you a few questions through the poll tool. And with that, I will hand it over to Ken and Scott, our speakers for today.
All right, thank you, Christina. Yeah, hi, this is Ken Panani. I am Director for IT Business Applications at Teradata. I am responsible for the application development through operations for our ServiceNow platform, as well as others. And I'd like to introduce Scott with us from xtype.
Yes, thank you, Ken. Scott Wilson, 2 L's in Wilson. I'm the head of product marketing at xtype, and I'm happy to be with you today, Ken, to talk about what you've done.
Awesome. All right, our agenda for today is really going to be talking about some challenges that we went through as we were taking on a new instance in our realm, being FedRAMP, the GCC, as we now call them within ServiceNow, right? In addition to our commercial environment. And then how did we go about transforming our approach? How did we gain some efficiencies and yet meet the needs of compliance with those environments? We'll give a little bit of a live demo, neutralize. xtype's here to help us go through that. And we'll wrap up with some best practice key takeaways, as well as opening up to Q&A at the end. So a quick poll question. Where are you in your FedRAMP journey? You can give a quick response. We'll take a few seconds here.
That's probably good.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much. Looks like we've got a bit of a mix here. All right. So let's talk about challenges. Where did we run into some different challenges? So we hit the next slide. So for us, what we were doing is our normal BAUs, everyday type of release management. We were moving update sets as usual across the multiple instances that we've got, releasing to production, regular urgent things that need to be updated for the business, special projects as we do feasibility studies, or we're rolling out something new in parallel with what we're already running. But we took on one of those special projects being, we're going to roll out a FedRAMP instance. And so now we had to deal with some complexities between the ServiceNow GCC, Government Community Cloud instances, we affectionately call our FedRAMP instances, as well as our commercial instances. And how do we balance all that? How do we deal with that, set of trains? And then obviously with FedRAMP itself comes a number of compliance activities, right? How do we deal with this boundary that exists for FedRAMP, and how do we make sure that we're compliant to all of that, as well as meeting our business needs at the same time? And then in conjunction with the manual operations, we're all familiar with how we move update sets, around our instances and deploy those to production. We're not using like a GitHub repository, other, nature like that. So we're using standard out of the box, ServiceNow. So how do we deal with all of that? And then obviously with that comes inherent, risks. So let's talk about what some of those challenges were. So to give a little bit about background for us, our monthly volume is around 3,000 plus update sets. We release over 100 release packages, and we have 14 instances within our environment. So with that, we also then have our regular cloning. Our cloning cycles are on monthly, except dev. We do give a reprieve on dev and our developers for what they need to do. We do that on a quarterly basis where we clone over all of our instances and make sure that we're in sync. We do have periodically some on-demand cloning for various needs. And obviously, as we're all familiar, we do have exceptions. We have some things that we have to preserve in some of that different cloning, and that can vary depending on the instance as well. Then we have a lengthy list of constraints. As we just mentioned, FedRAMP, this was new for us. How do we deal with all the different compliance factors we have to deal with from a FedRAMP perspective? Yet, maintain least privilege. We need to coordinate manually still at this point in time across all of our different instances. We have those special projects mentioned to deal with. Ongoing business demands that are always coming in through our ideas portal, through different projects, ad hoc stuff that can come up. Obviously, we have scheduled releases. We work on a bi-weekly, twice a month release schedule, but then we also have other things that have to go out, as needed. They're unscheduled. Sometimes we have a little bit of notice. Sometimes they're, fairly quick. We need to turn that around. Another complication in our particular case is we do our change management in yet another instance. We have our corporate instance. So we have our commercial customer-facing instances, as well as our internal-facing corporate instance. So how do we manage that with our change management there? And then obviously with ServiceNow's GCC instances, there's additional constraints that come with all of that as well. Outside of that, we have our integrations that we have to deal with. So we have in our current regular instances, over 35 systems that we also integrate with. And in our FedRAMP world, we are approximately 20 instances that we have to be able to coordinate. And everybody's got their different schedules. Some people do things on a monthly basis, some are on a weekly, some are on a midweek, some are at the end of the week. So how do we coordinate all of that? It was also part of the trick that we need to be able to deal with. So that's a little bit of background on where we're coming from. The big driver for us and how we're going to tackle this and do this a little bit differently, because we have our routine, right? We've got our drills, we know our stuff. Everybody's doing just fine. But now with this wrinkle, FedRAMP, right? How are we going to deal with that in the pulls between our business continuity and what we need to do there with our commercial, and now the constraints from FedRAMP? And some of the big factors in that were really about RBAC, role-based access controls. How do we deal with that a little differently? Because that's not how we have our current instance, our standard instances configured. They have roles, we have our groups and everything, but it's a little bit different configuration. So we need to adapt for that. Notifications, big change, right? As those of you who are working on FedRAMP already, very much a redaction. You don't communicate much through there. People need to go back into their instances and go see the details. And then the last one is data flows. Data doesn't flow just however you wish, pushing or pulling, it's all pull because you have to control the border. You have to be able to pull what comes across. And what little can go out has to be very tightly controlled and make sure that it meets all the criteria. So this was a bit of a change for us as well. So that kind of brings us to our next notion, which was, what does all this kind of look like? So let's take a moment and walk through that. So our release managers, as I like to affectionately call them, are our superheroes. They're the ones who are helping us manage across this plethora of instances, right? We've got all our business demands that we just talked about. We've got our schedules, which we can calendarize. And then we got our other stuff that's more by the clock. Are we done by a certain side of the time, right, of the day? We've got our standard instances that various people with their various roles have access to. And our release managers, they have their checklist, just like we all do. How are we deploying? Where are we getting it out to? And what are we integrating with, right? So there's a lot to coordinate there. Then comes the next piece. How do we deal with that FedRAMP? right? We've done our cloning, we've got our environments in sync, but then there's FedRAMP. So what we've done is we have our development teams are around the world. And so we need to have an ability to be able to allow them to still continue to develop and test and deal with all those different instances and deal with upgrades that are coming, right? Because as we know, those of you who are already working in FedRAMP, when you're in the boundary, because ServiceNow's build is for FedRAMP high, and we're currently, for everybody's reference, we're going for FedRAMP medium currently. High is in the future state. That's the next phase. But we're in medium. So that means everybody else doesn't have necessarily requirements as far as in-country and that sort of thing. But ServiceNow's instances do, because they're designed for high. So we've got this boundary then. How do we deal with that? And how do we deal with our release managers then? And how do we get that information across? Very manual. You have to be able to download all that to your system, be able to upload it up on the other side. And it's very manual intensive. And it takes a lot of time to do that. In addition, we have then those instances that are managed within the boundary, right? We've got our stage, our pre-prod, our production instances, and we still have cloning to do because we want to make sure everything's in sync across the board. But this is what we're dealing with, is how do we manage through this? And we do it in a we were doing it in a very much serial fashion. So we would go through our normal dev, test, stage, pre-prod, roll out to production. Then move it over into our FedRAMP instance. How do we need to retweak it for development over on that side of the house? Retest it, make sure it's ready, move it over on the other side as we go to stage, right? And release over to production ultimately on that side of the house. Very serial nature, time consuming again. How do we get around that? That's a little bit of background of our challenge. So we'd like to understand, where are you? How many instances do you happen to manage perhaps? Awesome. Okay. We are very much in that larger space. So good. Hopefully this is applicable to many. I love the comment. So let's talk about what we've done to kind of get through that. So in our transformation, we took into account a few things, right? We wanted to make sure that we had utter control on those two primary trains, our commercial instances and our FedRAMP instances. And then how did we deal with that wall again, right? But at the same time, we wanted to make sure, understanding across all that, how do we bring central governance, reductions in potential errors, reduce our time to deploy because we're running in serial. So how do we get that consolidated better? And then make sure all those instances are in sync, because that's a lot of instances to manage, as many of you, based on the survey results, are indicating. You guys get where we're coming from. So first thing we wanted to try and tackle was that central command and control. So what we've done is we put in place an ability to centrally manage and monitor across all of our instances, all at the same time, one-stop shop. We also have an ability where we can actually smart sync. What that means is we can go forward into an instance and say we've done the appropriate testing and we find a wrinkle, right? This isn't quite right. We need to make a change to that. We can actually make the change there and smart sync it back to our dev. You don't have to fully revert back to dev to be able to then progress forward. We also wanted to make sure everybody has the right access levels. Remember that least privilege we talked about earlier. We want to make sure that everybody has the appropriate access, both from our developers, our testers, business users, et cetera. And then also because of the FedRAMP piece, we need total traceability. We need to be able to go through audits and understand who's done what, where, and when, right? Key for us to be able to progress. We also wanted to make sure our release management is really going to be much easier to manage our update sets. How do we make sure we've got the right release packages? How do we make sure those are going down our trains appropriately so we know what we're delivering and when? And we want to make sure that we're doing, again, that in an efficient manner so that we can hopefully gain some time reductions, right? We want to be able to deliver faster. And then the last big constraint for us was getting that at least 90% continuity. So for us, in that case, some things were, well, we got to do this differently for FedRAMP. does it make sense not for us to also do that for our commercial instances? So yeah, actually it probably would. So now we've got developments that are happening over in our FedRAMP instance. We've got developments that are happening over in our commercial instances. And we need to make sure we've got that continuity, right? And maintain that throughout. We also want to make sure again, that traceability we talked about, not only for roles, but how do we manage that across our boundaries? How do we make sure we've got that traceability from instance to instance and so forth, right? And then the last factor is, in our particular realm, we do our SDLC through another system. We're a Jira shop, and we do all of our work through Jira. And so how do we make sure that that's in sync with what we're doing from a Jira perspective and managing our SDLC and making sure, again, we're gaining those efficiencies? So let's take a look at a moment what we actually did in that regard. So what we've been able to do is actually better orchestrate our release management and instance management. So our business demands all still remain the same. We've still got our project teams, we've still got our individuals, great ideas, we've still got schedules, and of course we've got, urgent business changes that we have to be able to facilitate. So our standard instances are here and our FedRAMP instances are here, but now we're orchestrating. We're not having to act like superheroes all the time. And now what we've introduced and why our xtype friends are here with us is to help us take this piece up the middle. We've got xtype's instance management, release management. This allows us to better orchestrate exactly what we're doing. So when we do our development, right, we can do our development in our FedRAMP instance or in our commercial instance, and we can sync across. And we can make sure that we're not running into any particular conflicts. We're making sure that we can be able to develop in an appropriate manner and make sure what should be working over here, for instance, on the FedRAMP, is not necessarily being executed over here in the commercial as appropriate. In some cases, they need to work simultaneously across both. And so we have all those parameters being applied here, and we can make sure that now our development is in sync. We can do development together, and we can go forward together into our test. We've eliminated that serial path now. We no longer have to be able to go from dev, test on out, and then the next series of dev, test, and out. We can actually now make sure that we can progress together. We can synchronize our environments together, and we have the right gates in place. So the appropriate people have the authority to be able to push the button and say, hey, I'm ready. This can go from dev to test. And now the testers can come in and they can do their parts and test, and they can click the button and say, yep, this is approved and ready to go on to stage, right? So now we can actually move to that next piece. And because of what xtype allows us to do is because that orchestration, and you notice the boundary is still there, but the wall went away because it's more insignificant to us now. Because now with xtype, we have our instances that are managed within the boundary, but it allows us to move it, right? We don't have to have people managing all the downloads and everything. xtype is actually allowing us to be able to do that boundary control, do it with full traceability, making sure that we meet all our compliance, mandates from a FedRAMP perspective at the same time. And we've now achieved our goal of being able to simultaneously be able to move forward to stage environment and do our next round of testing. And now we can control our business users, their access, our other people who need to be able to get in there, and pre-prod. We do one last check, bring our other reviewers in, we do all of our different checks and balances, make sure that pre-prod is exactly what we want it to be before we then go to production. So with that, we've now finished our train, and now we're just chugging down the train track together in parallel. And that has saved us a bunch of time. And so what we can also do, in addition, not only just our normal paths, we have those additional pieces we talked about. We've got those special projects. We can have our offline shoot over here, and we can sync where appropriate. And then where maybe things are not, we don't. But we control that fully. Again, central command and control. And that has been really a great benefit for us. The other is our upgrades. Now with our upgrades, like most everybody here, you're probably either doing it twice a year or annually, right? We can manage our upgrades in sync as well. So as we're doing our regular transitions, as we do our BAU, we're managing our upgrades in parallel. And we have a runway of time that we do in front of that. So we've got both happening at the same time. And what we're always able to do then is we can still sync our BAU activities that we're releasing on a bi-weekly basis or more frequent as needed. We're also pushing those up to our upgrade instance at the same time. That happens because of the syncing that we're able to do, and it happens very efficiently now. And so now, as our upgrade tests are continuing, not only are we in our BAU with our current version, we're also testing our next version, making sure everything is working there all at the same time. So this has been a really great benefit for us. So what does that mean? So as we work through that, we gained a lot of benefits. I mentioned time efficiency, right? So that is something that we have been able to take a normal release, which could take a full day to run through, and that can get down to a matter of hours, 2 hours, maybe 3 hours. If we are looking to sync across all of our environments, that takes us 10 to 12 hours to complete. Full synchronizations when we need to be able to do it, we get that down to an hour. These are huge reductions for us. And this has been able to allow our release management team to more focus on other priorities, other projects, and make sure that we're running very efficiently in everything that we're doing. The next benefit that we saw was actually in the world of smart sync. So this allows us to automate our update set deployments. It allows us to take things like I mentioned earlier on, to move from like a QA environment and run that back to our dev. That way we don't have to waste extra time running all the way back to re-promoting and everything. We can just do a quick fix there, drive it back. Management of those update sets is much easier as well, because now we can get into a position where we can drag and drop and we can build those packages now. So we can sequence our update sets, we can put them in the proper order, and when we build that package, it's always going to maintain that going forward. We don't have to rely on a checklist. Okay, did I do 1, then 2, then 3? It's already packaged. And it's already, we know as we're going down that train line, as we talked, it's always going to be that way. And so that's been a huge benefit for us, because that also helps us with error reductions. Did we get something out of order? Did we miss a step? Did we get it to all the appropriate instances, right? Sometimes it happens. Mistakes happen. We're all human. So we've been able to better minimize those situations. And again, because we're able to centrally monitor everything that we've got, we can actually better track from that single console. We can see, and you guys will see this in a moment on the demo, you'll be able to see exactly where everything is, which instance, what part of the stages, where things have been promoted, where they're not, and you can validate. Maybe that special project wasn't supposed to get that. Yep, check, it's not there. Or it was supposed to get there. It's not supposed to be over here, but it's supposed to be there. Again, you can track all that and centrally govern that. But again, that governance, that was a big driver for us, because when we're talking FedRAMP, as we all know, federal regulations, you need to make sure that you are ready for your audits and you have that traceability. That role-based access control, being able to deploy with full traceability, making sure that we meet the various policies that are in place has been a great advantage for us, because that allows us to seamlessly pull out what we need, be able to provide, and we have full transparency. And so that's been a great asset for us, because when we come to those audit logs, we all know sometimes that can be a bit of a challenge, and administration is a headache, but we all have to deal with it. And that's part of what we can more seamlessly do here as well. And the last benefit that we saw was, because of the ability to do all this in more central fashion, it's more user-friendly for the team, right? So the team who's actually going through that, and there's a lot of complexity here that we deal with, it has been easier for the team to be able to go through that collectively. So really, we're really thankful for the move that we did. Again, it's not that we weren't managing, but we're now doing it in a much more efficient manner, in a more controlled manner. But we're not done. We still have work to do. So as we get into that, we still, as I mentioned earlier, we're a Jira shop. Our next step, and we're actually right on the cusp of this, we're actually integrating Jira with our ServiceNow and our CI/CD management chain to be able to automate those stages. And where we've got our electronic approvals over there from one stage to another, that will be able to flow in. And that's going to actually be our triggers then as we move that along. So again, it'll be hands off. Nobody has to jump in there and go even click a button in the system. We're also working on integrating that other system we talked about. We have our corporate instance where we do change management. So how are we going to be able to pull that in? Because we've still got to go through cabs just like everybody else. How do we make sure that last approval is in place? And again, full documentation transparency. So today, we're plugging a couple pieces together, but we're much better than we were. We're just trying to finish off those last parts and pieces that we want to be able to get to. The other is, as we've been working through this, we're trying to improve our XML deployments. We're trying to make sure that we can do deployment pauses, potentially cancellations. Sometimes, again, stuff happens and, oh, we're not ready to deploy that just yet. Let's hold that, and we got to cancel that package, right? And then the other is just making sure when stuff does happen that we've got good, clear logging and notifications. So these are things that we've partnered with xtype. We're actually deploying all this right now, and we're really thankful for the progress that we've made. But again, we're still on a journey. So we want to make sure that, we've been able to plan ahead and make sure that we understand where we're going and how do we get there. So why don't we take a stop for another poll question, Scott? Okay, so are you operating in a regulated industry, whether that's FedRAMP or others? You deal with these complexities, you deal with these compliance factors, right? How do you manage that across all of your different instances? So let's kind of see where everybody's at on that as well. Okay, hopefully we can see the results on that. Oh, great. We've got a good mix. So 2/3 of the group are actually dealing with this already. So hopefully this is useful for you guys. So very good. Okay, Scott, I am going to turn it over to you to let you do some speaking for a change. Thanks so much.
Good. Take a sip of water. I'm only going to take about 3 minutes of your time just to put a picture to what everything Ken said, so you could visually relate to what he said. So if you bear with me here, I am going to bring up my browser window so I can paint that picture for you. And let's dive right into it. So what you got here and what you're looking at here is xtype. This is what Ken was talking about here. To give you a quick view here, you can see I would have all of his, or how Ken would see all of his instances up above. Obviously, we're not showing Teradata's environment. Hopefully you can appreciate that, but you can see across the top the label of all the instances on that train that he'd mentioned. He can actually see the different versions of ServiceNow across each of those as well. Additionally, Ken can see what he had mentioned is kind of the forensics of what's going on across all of those instances, where things are. If you want to take a look at what the blockers are, maybe there's something that's paused. So for example, you could click here and get the details on what was happening. In this case, there was a preview error. So he's got the who, what, when, and where, who authorized this or who moved it forward. You can see how things were migrated, and of course the quick links to jump in and resolve those issues. We could even look at errors as well. If an actual error occurred, and I could jump into the details and resolve those. In this case, it looks like an ATF, automated test framework test failed. The point is that Ken now has that single pane of glass to very quickly look and identify everything. And going back to his RBAC question, xtype is now managing the migration of his update sets from instance to instance instead of a developer needing admin privileges. So this allows him to set up more fine-grained controls. So what do I mean by that? Well, first thing is, very quickly, xtype allows you to define, or allows Teradata to define, deployment policies. And what the policy is, for example, just to pull one up, these policies have direction and scope. So from here, I'm going from dev to QA, and I can define what a trigger is. In this case, we've got a code scan set up, an ATF, a manual approval. And the beautiful thing is, anytime any migration is happening from one instance to the other that fits this criteria and the scope, it'll apply this automatically. So he gets that safety that he's looking for, especially in the environment that he just described. Additionally, if we want to look at the roles and permissions, as I mentioned before, they're fully fine-grained. You can set those up here as well. Very easy, very configurable. That way, again, your developers do not require admin privileges across all of your instances. You're better able to control that. Just another thing that Ken had mentioned about setting up his environment that I want to highlight here. Here you can see a bit of an audit of the environment I've got set up. And so these green lines and these blue lines are basically a mapping of all the remote instances that we've got set up in our environment, but Ken and Teradata can see this as well. And the beautiful thing is, if I were to, for example, put in a new stage, just to highlight something, if any one of these were bypassing the boundaries he had set, you'd see this nice yellow line indicating that, hey, there was a problem and you've got to go resolve that problem. Or, if development, for example, had access to production, which is something Teradata definitely does not want. And then lastly, what I wanted to jump in on and just describe is that he'd mentioned that they have release packages. xtype provides release packages where you can just drag and drop all of the elements that you want to be bundled together in a package and then deploy that payload. And then what xtype is going to do, and what Ken was kind of describing, is he has that full audit history of the who, what, when, and where of those contents, when they are moved, when they got committed. And you can even tie this to a ServiceNow change request as well. So you follow your normal process and your service change request, and this bill of materials will get deployed at that point. And there's much, much more, but I'm not here to demo xtype. I'm just trying to paint that picture for you as to what Ken did, so you have a visual to follow along with what he had. So with that, let's come back, Ken. I'll throw it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott. That was really great. There's a lot in there, and I know that was a quick nutshell. So, but, definitely be glad to, talk more about that. But I think from a key takeaways perspective, what do we do with this? How do we maybe approach this? Some of you are already on the path. Some of you are about to undertake it, right? So one of the first key things I would really, really suggest for everybody is really baseline your inventory. Understand all your different instances, how they need to interact with each other. What are the different plugins? What are the versions of your plugins? Because again, with so many instances and so many different plugins that we all use, keeping track and control of all that is difficult. And so it's really a good exercise to just re-baseline all of that. Make sure that you've got everything updated. Make sure that you've got that in sync as a good starting point. Get your baseline set up. That's been a really good piece for us, because then from there, it's management, right? You don't want to jump in and then everything all be discombobulated. And you'll find some of that. We found a couple. We thought we had it all synced up, but again, we're human. So, but getting that baseline as much as possible is a really great starting point. Then understanding those controls. That was the next big piece for us, was because we were new to the whole FedRAMP environment, right? We've already had our understanding of how we're managing. We've been doing it for a long time in ServiceNow, our standard commercial instances. But FedRAMP was introducing this additional wrinkle. And how do we need to have and meet these different compliance needs? And that took a lot of work, really a lot of work and a lot of time. And then being able to prepare for that. How do we manage that? How do we monitor that, right? And it's not a one and done. Trust me. I know many of you who are already in this already realize that. But it's a really good place to then get that inventory, get that full line of controls, make sure you understand what you're up against and what you need to be able to meet, because that's going to drive some of your architecture, what you need to do with your data, right? Get a structured plan in place, pre-planned, because you're going to have your structured pieces and you're going to have some unstructured needs that all of a sudden you've got some ad hoc changes that you need to apply. Well, how do we deal with that? So make sure you understand your scenarios. That was something that we had to go through, and we thought we had all the scenarios 1 to 10, but then as we're going through, we'd come up with, an additional, we didn't realize, right? So make sure you take that time up front. It really is valuable, because as Scott just showed you a moment ago, and I know it was a quick snippet, but getting those routes set up, making sure you understand the policies, make sure you understand the controls that you want are really going to be important, and how you're going to release. We've all got different types of releases that we do. And meeting those scenarios up front, understanding that planning and pre-planning that as much as possible really helps you in the long run. So trying to give you guys some tips and pointers. Been down this path now for a little while. And, hopefully this will help kind of save some time for you guys as well. But then the next piece is governance, right? You've got all those different roles, those different people that need to be there. And, you probably, like us, you want to meet those least privileged. You don't want people necessarily able to do something that they shouldn't. Not that they're going to do something, on purpose, but sometimes people make mistakes and they'll inadvertently do something that, oh, I didn't realize that was the outcome if I did that. Stuff happens. So make sure you've got that governance model. Make sure you've got your whole RBAC, set up, right? You know exactly who's there to do what and when, and get those controls put in place, because now you've got your plans of your scenarios, you've got your who's and how's, and now you can work through your development lifecycle, right? In your release trains. So now you can chug along, like I showed earlier. How do we move from stage to stage? How do we move from instance to instance? How do we make sure that all those parts and pieces are moving appropriate paths with the appropriate approvals and gates and all that? So now all that can kind of come married together. And then with that, now we've got a workable model. Now we've actually got something that allows us to go to production on a repeated manner. We can deal with those side projects. We can deal with those upgrades, right? We can manage all these parts in much more efficient manner. And the last thing is, don't just think one and done either. Like I mentioned, you do have a future. You've got future changes. I'm sure you guys are all looking at your roadmaps. Keep those in mind. So make sure where you're going to be having some future steps, make sure you've built the paths for those, so you don't have to go backwards and do some rework later on, because you're going to have to make some adjustments. So think about those future building blocks. Make sure you're thinking about those future process controls and those automations. We're all looking at how do we be more efficient. It's always how to do more with less, right? Think about how you can go and take those next steps. Just like I articulated, we're in that same process right now. But because we already knew we were going there, we were able to build our roadmap and the steps we were building here to facilitate those. So we know exactly where we're headed. We know exactly how we're going to get there, and make sure you guys have done likewise. It really is a time saver in the long run, and it's going to be a win for everybody at the end of the day when you ultimately are delivering your processes and your products out the door. All right. Thank you so much. All right. Well, let's take a look and see what questions we may have had that have come in, perhaps. If anybody has anything we can answer.
Yeah, so I got a few here, Ken. First one is, what was the turning point for Teradata when it became clear that the manual GCC commercial environment wasn't sustainable?
Okay, good question. I think really when we started going, again, I talked about understanding those compliance factors. When we realized how big of a wall that wall was, right, for FedRAMP there, and that boundary, and how much it was going to manage us, because we all get only one shot at releasing into that boundary, right? So once you've done all your cleanups, you've got everything sterilized, everything cleaned up as best as you can, and you deploy for the first time in boundary, that's it. After that, you're in boundary and you're making those changes and making everything in there. So getting our updates, that's again, trying to maintain that 90%, continuity across both our commercial and FedRAMP. That posed a big challenge for us because we knew we had a big administrative headache because of that boundary. And so we needed to find something. We needed to look and see, is there anything out there? Is there something that somebody's built on ServiceNow to help us with ServiceNow type deployments in and around these boundaries? And that's how we stumbled across xtype some time back. And so we've kind of gone down that journey. We've been working through making sure that's, as efficient as possible. But that was really it for us, is going back to that step of understanding what do we need from a compliance perspective and what is the work going to be to make that happen.
Okay, I got another question is, what advice would you give to people who are just starting on their FedRAMP journey?
Plan. Really, just like we just talked a moment ago about key takeaways, planning is really key, and understanding the requirements of FedRAMP. Work with your InfoSec teams closely. They're going to be a great trusted advisor. Whoever you're working with as your consulting company or your sponsor, ask questions, get clarifications. They'll definitely be able to help keep you on the path where you've got questions. Hey, can I do this or can I do that? Get that feedback. Don't make assumptions. Definitely work in concert with your partners out there to make sure you understand what those requirements are.
And we got a last question here, Ken. And it is, how has xtype changed, or how does it handle plugins across your environments?
Yeah, plugins is a big piece for us. As I mentioned earlier, that was a piece where we discovered, we thought we were getting everything all cleaned up and whatnot, but that wasn't all the case, right? We had some misses. And so, like Scott showed up there a moment ago in the demo, we can actually see where we are from a plugin perspective as well. We can see our versions, we can see our plugins, and that allows us to be able to see where we're out of sync. And so we can get those deployed. And now what we do is every time we've got new versions come up, we can get those synchronously deployed across. So it's been a great benefit for us in that regard. We manage a lot of plugins as an organization, so it's been a huge win for us.
Perfect. And I would just add, Ken, that same view I showed on the screen applies to the plugins as well. We can show you the versions that are deprecated, what version they'll work in your environment, all that kind of stuff. I think there's one last poll question though, Christina. Is that right?
Looks like somebody put in the chat. Oh no, just one quick question, Scott. Yeah, there was one that came up in the chat just now. So if we can maybe take that one. That came from Mike. So yeah, Mike, for us, cloning is something that, we've been able to make sure that we minimize. Now, cloning, obviously these syncs don't deal with data. It is just literally our update sets. So we will clone down data, but what it does is it makes it a lot simpler for us now. So we don't have to necessarily fully reapply all of our plugins. There are some, we do need to look at things, and this is something that we're working with Scott and team to understand. In some cases, some of the plugins have some actions to be taken. So we do need to be cognizant of that. So sometimes we do need to, reapply post-clone, but all in all, that syncing across and packaging, that is what drove us from 12 hours to manually keep pushing everything out across everywhere fully at once to an hour. That's been the huge win for us.
Perfect. Any
Hopefully
other
that helps answer the question, Mike. If it's not, just, please come back. Okay.
Of course, please answer the poll question. If we got the results of those yet, but perfect.
Awesome.
Christina.
And then for those of you who do have other questions or something comes to mind or you want to chat offline, feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to help others in need. We're all ultimately in this journey together as we all learn and, progress. ServiceNow is a great platform, and it's our community here that, makes us all that more empowered to get through it all. So thanks, everybody.
Yes, thank you so much, Ken and Scott, for sharing. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Looking forward to seeing you in the next event, and maybe on Knowledge. If you're on Knowledge, look for us. We're going to
We'll be there for sure.
Yes. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.